Hey, it's Jim, and this is Level 2 of the CFA program, the topic on ethics and professional standards, and the learning module on Code of Ethics and Standards of Professional Conduct. Let me just quickly remind you that the initial learning module inside of this volume is really kind of a summary of definitions of ethics and how professionals and professional organizations promote ethical behavior, and in fact have a responsibility to promote that ethical behavior, to increase the standards and the acceptable behavior of everybody inside of an industry or an organization. This learning module really introduces the CFA Institute's idea about what ethics and professional conduct ought to look like. So we're going to essentially do a couple of things here inside of this learning module. We're going to talk about this professional conduct program. We'll do that in a bunch of slides, but then at the end of the slide deck, we'll talk about the 6 components, and those are 6 really good potential exam questions. And then the 7 standards of professional conduct. And we'll talk just briefly about each of those standards, because after you're done watching this video, you're going to watch 7 videos on those 7 standards. And each one of those is, I'm going to say somewhere around 30 minutes in length. So let's get started with this Standards of Practice Handbook. And I'm going to give you a little history lesson, a personal history lesson, that when I went through the program, over 2 decades ago, and this is back in the days when you used to get the books in their physical mode. Well, I got this Standards of Practice Handbook, and those people that I talked to said, if you're on the edge, the Institute will look at your scores in the ethics component of the exam. And just a quick reminder, remember, the Institute tells us it's 15 to 20% of the exam. So I was told, and I'm not sure if this was true back then, not even sure if it's true today, that if you're on the cusp of passing and you get everything right in this ethics, on those ethics questions, that the Institute is very likely to pass you. I'd like to think that that's true, but the important point is that this is a super important component of the CFA program. In fact, what you could do if the Institute, if I were writing these questions from the Institute's perspective, I would reach into all of the other topics that we touch on in the program and extract out a sentence or two and then put in an ethics or professional standards question, which of course the Institute pretty much does. Anyway, my final point of this is that what I did is I carried this handbook around with me all the time. And, it's a thick book. It's this, I don't know how many pages it was. I wish I could show it to you right now, although I don't have it on me anymore because I just recently lent it to one of my students who's going to take the exam in one of these upcoming months. But anyway, my point is that I read this thing over and over and over, and there are a million different mini examples in there. And if you cover these things over and over again, you're bound to get these questions correct. All right, so what's the purpose of the handbook? The purpose for us in general, to answer this in a general question, is that it gives us a really good idea of how to deal with these ethical problems that arise. Now, of course, the explicit reason, look down at that bottom orange bullet point, is this is helping you study for the CFA Level I exam and Level 2 and then Level 3, etc., etc. But I like the blue point in there because, as you guys know, I'm an academic here, connects ethical theory and practical application. All right, so we've got this Code of Ethics, contains high-level ethical principles, and the Standards of Professional Conduct, which kind of are mini subcases of the Code of Ethics. You know, the Code of Ethics, think of it as like the umbrella, and then the 7 standards go underneath the umbrella. Each standard says something like, you know, you have to work hard. You know, you're going to see in the Standards of Professional Conduct, you're going to see the words due diligence pretty regularly. You know, so the ethics up here, the umbrella says, you know what, you better work hard. If a client is going to pay you $35,000 to put together a policy statement, well, you ought to do it in more than a Friday afternoon, like some of my students do when they're studying for an exam. I'll go ahead and read that bottom orange point to you because I love that word, interwoven tapestry. Oh boy. Wait till you look at the handbook and wait till you see all of the interwoven tapestries that the Institute presents to us. Now, here's some advice in answering these questions. It seems to me that when you look at the problems at the end of each of these learning modules, the Institute gives you, you have 3 choices when they come in multiple choice format. And so there's one choice that's almost obviously wrong. And then there are 2 choices that sound about right. What you need to make sure you do is read the answer choices very carefully, slowly, and completely. Because the Institute, although I would never accuse them, like my students do, accuse me of trickeration, the Institute is not like that. But what they want you to make certain is that you can differentiate with the breadth and the depth of these learning modules. All right, of course, important element of a CFA Institute's education. So these are for current members, for candidates, provides guidance for all sorts of things. I like that word in there, interpreting. What we'll find when you listen to my recordings is the term reasonable shows up pretty regularly. What the Institute is really trying to get us to do is to think as a reasonable individual. Back in the old days, they used the word prudent. And that's a good word, but just be reasonable. I mean, I tell my students all the time, answer questions, just put something that's reasonable on your answer sheet. I try to tell my family members, you know what, you have decisions. What sounds reasonable? If it's way out there, then it's probably not reasonable. Now, the questions that you guys are going to be facing are definitely that second bullet point there, application of the code and standards in various situations. When you look at this handbook, there are a million questions in there, and each one has a different scenario and then a different application. They're hypothetical but factual. They are fictional. There's almost every question is a member or a candidate unless otherwise stated. I'm not quite sure what that application might be, but they might say something like, oh, here's somebody who worked for the SEC. But what we'll find here is that if you work for the SEC, you ought to try to convince the SEC to adopt the CFA code and the standards. Yeah, examples are not intended to be all-inclusive. This is a problem that I got, especially when I first did this back in level 1. When I looked at the question stem and then looked at the choices, I remember thinking to myself, well, all 3 of these choices sound reasonable. And that was from my academic background. Now, once you listen to my 7 videos here, and including this one, so this is an 8th one, what you'll be able to do is identify that one choice that really is not reasonable. It might sound reasonable, but there's a word or 2 in there that throws you off. And then you'll be able to distinguish between the 2 good choices. May have legal implications. Okay. Encouraged to discuss. Oh yeah, the Institute loves this. You've heard me say this before. At least I'm hoping you heard me say this before, that the Institute is very big on monitoring. They're very big on reviewing. They're very big on asking yourself the question, all right, I did this. What went right? What went wrong? How can I improve? Now, what that means is that you don't really want to do this all on your own. Just talk to people around you, your supervisors, your colleagues. As you go through the CFA program, you're probably going to meet people maybe on social media, or maybe you meet people while you're taking the test. I do have a funny story. I don't even know if I'm allowed to tell this, but I took the level 1 exam, 100 years ago. My advice is to make sure you, before you go sit down, that you go to the restroom. Make sure you go to the restroom so that you don't have to bolt to the restroom and sprint across the room so that you don't waste time. Remember, they don't give you extra time for a restroom break. Yeah, the handbook is not meant to be like a super comprehensive, although you're going to think about it because it's so thick. You're going to think, gosh, this covers every scenario out there. But that's not true. Of course, the code and the standards, it's an evolving process. Every so often they update the handbook. The most recent one was in 2023. Maintain high ethical standards. Yeah, legitimate concerns. Yeah, this is what I think. If you when I introduce myself or I say something to people or they see some kind of document, I have my name and I have a comma and I have PhD after it and then I have CFA after it. That's an appropriate use. And while my PhD program took lots and lots of time and tremendous amount of effort, that was full time, I was able to complete the CFA program in part-time, which was what you guys are trying to do because, you have jobs, et cetera, et cetera. But you're going to be very proud when you can put that those 3 letters after your name. I promise you. And the Institute knows that. And that's why it's making you do all of this work, because they want to make certain that you have lots of competence. We'll talk about that in just a minute. And that you have these high ethical standards. Now, this 2023 revision included just a handful of changes. Standard 1, they added competence. Standard 2, they added something about disclosures. And standard 6, they added avoid or disclose. Now, it's not like this wasn't a part of the program beforehand, but now it's a point of emphasis. So we have a couple of slides here on what these changes are, but for now, I'm not sure you need to know these changes because I will talk at length about them when you watch those recordings. I will say something about Standard 5. This seemed to be a point of emphasis as I went through the reading. And, I have the benefit of being able to look at the old reading and then take a look at the new reading, and I can see the difference. But the point of emphasis now inside of this Standard 5 is communication and disclosure with mostly face-to-face clients. So when you're facing a client, you need to make sure that you disclose not only all of your costs, but also costs associated with third parties or external research or just talking to your cousin Ed. Make sure that you emphasize the disclosure of those costs. Also, Standard 6 with the disclosure of conflicts. This is an obvious thing. The best practice is just to avoid the conflict of interest. But the Institute doesn't want you just to go stick your head in the sand and sit in the corner and say, oh, I'm going to have a potential conflict of interest, therefore I can't do anything. And the Institute recognizes that you're going to be faced with these, but the Institute is calling on you to rise above that conflict. If it's a massive conflict, then you need to avoid it, right? Just if you're a board of directors, just remove yourself from something. But you're going to have minor conflicts of interest, and just make sure that you disclose those. And don't be selective in your disclosure. Don't say, oh, I'm going to disclose to these people over here, and I'm going to ignore these people over here. And there's a question in this Standard 6, and I'll probably mention this in the video, that there's a wealth advisor out there who discloses it to his current clients, but fails to disclose it to prospective clients. Well, that's a violation right there. So that's a point of emphasis. Now, of course, the CFA Institute says, you know what, you need to comply with the code and the standards. There is a board of governance out there with this PCP, which is a part of the Disciplinary Review Committee. And this is what I encourage you to do. In fact, it might be worth it for you to pause the video, go to the CFA Institute webpage, and go to the disciplinary actions. And there are a whole bunch of on there, and some of them are super detailed in terms of saying, here's a member who violated all these standards, and you get all of the details. In fact, now remember, the Institute says that all of their questions on the exam are fictional and they're based on facts, but those actual cases are probably good general kinds of ideas about what members and candidates have done. One of the things that I will tell you that's relatable to your exam is that the Institute will say to its proctors, look, when the exam is over, the exam is over. So you have to make sure you put your pencil down when the exam is over. Now, of course, there's electronic testing out there, so I don't know that you'll have that opportunity, but just make sure that you don't go overboard, because that's a clear violation. Now, the next question, and this is probably a good idea for you to know for the exam, is the simple fact that there are lots and lots of ways for unethical behavior to show up somewhere out there that the Institute becomes aware of it. Of course, there's self-disclosure, and this is what the Institute recommends. They recommend that you say something like, hey, you know what? This is what I did. I'm not quite sure if I violated. I talked to my compliance department. I talked to my colleagues. And of course, you don't have to do all that because of confidentiality, but it always makes sense to try to make sure that you are aware of what the ethical issue is, self-disclosure. So, hey, what do you think about this? Now, there can be written complaints. One of your colleagues or competitors could say, hey, you know what? I saw Jim over there the other day, and he was doing this and this and this, and this is a clear violation of Standard 1 and 3 and 7, et cetera, written complaints. But it can also come through public sources, such as media articles. And so this is a great question. And you'll hear me give this example in one of those future videos. I remember years and years ago, watching an NBA game, and there was a big fight on the game. And one of the guys who was in the fight, he went over to the scorer's table and laid down on the scorer's table. And some of the fans threw beer on him, or popcorn, or a chicken sandwich, or a tuna sandwich. I forget exactly what it was. So this dude gets up, and they have a big fight with the fans. And I thought, you know what? What if that fan held the CFA designation? Now, of course, the fan is there just cheering like a regular person, and there was no financial advice given. There was no investment recommendation. There probably wasn't any conversation about wealth management at all. However, this fan, had he or she been holding the designation, acted in an unprofessional manner, so that when it gets on the newspaper, they say, oh, hey, there's Jim. He was in the stands. He threw popcorn. He got into a big fight. Oh, and by the way, he holds the CFA designation. So there's the public sources. There's the reports submitted by proctors on exam day. Make sure you follow all the rules. I remember being super nervous. Was I allowed? How many calculators could I have? And I was a big, and still am, the 12C. That's what I use. And so make sure the calculator has batteries in it. Make sure your pencil has lead in it. Make sure. So make sure you know all those details. And then, of course, you're not allowed to leave the exam and put some questions on social media, because you have people taking it on the East Coast, so you could have somebody go in and just memorize all the questions, and then social media publicize it out to all the people on the West Coast. I'm talking about, of course, here in the United States. So yeah, that's no good. All right, so what's going on here when an inquiry is initiated? And this is probably a good exam question as well. There are a couple of conclusions. There can be no disciplinary sanction. There can be an issuance of a cautionary letter, and there can be actual disciplinary measures. So this is another reason why I wanted you to go to the CFA Institute webpage and just casually read, just 2 or 3 of these, so you see the violation, you see what the Institute thought about that violation, and then you can see the disciplinary action. And what you can do is you can accept or reject them. In fact, there are multiple cases in there under which the member or the candidate doesn't respond at all. And so if the member or candidate doesn't respond at all, which means they're not defending him or herself, well, then the Institute, has no other choice but to say, well, you know what, we're going to preclude you from using the designation anymore. So there's public censure, there's suspension, prohibited from using the CFA the CFA designation, and revocation of the charter in serious cases. All right, let's talk about the adoption of the code and standards. So when you, after you pass when you sign up, when you register for level 1, you sign this thing saying, I will adhere to all of this stuff. So it applies to members and candidates inside of that CFA program. But I promise you, after you pass level 3 and you fill out that form every year, you're going to think to yourself, man, I did it. Hopefully you can say, you know what, Jim contributed 2 or 5% to my success. I hope you don't say, boy, if it wouldn't have been for Jim, I'd have passed a long time ago. Now, this is what's happening. I'm guessing that many of you work in firms where there are lots of those who hold the designation, and there are those of you who work in firms, and you'll be the only one. So either way, the CFA Institute is hopeful that every firm out there adopts the code, because what this is going to do is this is going to elevate the profession so that when people think of wealth advisors and financial analysts and all those little subcategories of job descriptions, that they say, hey, you know what? I look up to those people. I mean, this is a hard thing to overcome, especially after the financial crisis of 2008. And those of you who watched that great movie, The Big Short, I read the book before I watched the movie. But you come away from that movie thinking that, man, do these people have any ethics? All right, so that's what we're trying to do here. And there's a good orange box down there. We are claiming compliance. Now look down at the very bottom. This is what I was saying, that the ultimate goal is that we have strong global capital markets. What do strong global capital markets mean? Well, let's look up at the top. Markets are fair. What does that mean? That means that when you go to the New York Stock Exchange or you go to the Jakarta Stock Exchange, that when you pay a price that that reflects all relevant, material, publicly available information, a fair price. The markets are transparent, which means that, let me call your attention back to a couple of lessons that we learned throughout the program, security market line and capital market line and the efficient markets hypothesis from Eugene Fama back in 1965, where if you do all this work, due diligence again, that the compensation, the reward, must be linked to the risks taken. Now, of course, the Institute is aware that there are governments and government bodies and agencies and just organizations and all sorts of people out there that are going to have laws and regulations and rules. These are important, but they establish that ethical foundation. So this second little curved arrow point, that swings back to what you learned in the first module inside of this topic. Culture of ethics, that makes perfect sense. And at some point between me entering the program and just now, the Institute added language that said something like, hey, we want to make sure that we benefit society at large. That is part of one of the 10 questions that are at the end of this learning module. And when you read that, you'll think, hey, you know what, Jim told me about that. There's that ultimate benefit of society. Again, we want political, social, financial stability inside of the society. For financial society, a stable financial society, what that must rely on is this concept of efficient markets hypothesis and efficient global capital markets. Let's go back to our corporate finance learning module, where what does a business do? A business borrows money on the right-hand side of the balance sheet. It uses those proceeds to invest in assets that are going to generate a product line or service. What does that do? Promotes entrepreneurship, innovation, and of course you have to employ people, improve standard of living. So you get the sense here that ethics is kind of like at the bottom. It's the building block. You guys remember the building blocks model for determining some kind of an interest rate on a loan? So ethics is a building block that if you have the ethics, then you can pile all these other blocks on top of it. Yeah, keep going down. Efficient capital market, promote trust and integrity. Yeah, that makes perfect sense. How about capital market sustainability? I think about the Institute's model of going from, pioneering economies to emerging economies. Pioneering, what is the Institute called? I think they changed the name to frontier economy at some point, to developing economies, to developed economies. So this brings in the concept directly and indirectly about sustainability, that we want to flow all the way up, and we want to continue to improve, which means that once we get to the developed economy, then we can focus on all of these other kinds of things. What does it say there? Health of the whole market, broader context, decision making, corporate compensation, all these good things that relate to just one individual, and how one bad apple can ruin the whole bunch. You guys remember that song from the Osmond Brothers? I guarantee you guys don't even know who the Osmond Brothers are. There's your homework assignment. Go listen to Donny Osmond sing One Bad Apple. Oh, my sister used to love that song. Let's see. This slide builds on what we talked about just a few minutes ago, that, of course, there are governments out there and government agencies. What the government essentially decides is what is legal. But sometimes what's legal may be ethical, it may be unethical. So what the code and the professional standards does is say, okay, here's the legal stuff. This is the minimum. But then we're going to add some layers, maybe some of these bricks. We're going to add some layers so that we make certain that even though we might be operating within a legal framework, we might be mistreating some of our clients, and that's not going to be a good result for anybody. All right. So the Institute acknowledges that the laws cannot possibly cover all of the unethical behavior. And of course, you guys probably know this better than I do. Unethical behavior with social media. I don't know anything about social media. I have no idea what kind of unethics that you can perform out there using Snapchat or Twitter. We don't even call it anymore after that wealthy guy bought it. So look at the bolded line there. Considered morally correct, lacks enough resources, well thought out rules. Yeah, so a good exam question might be, hey, here's a regulatory agency. This is where they stop because they lack some resources, because they don't know, they're not on top of these things. So we're going to add some layers. Now, applying the ethical framework, these are the exam questions that you're going to face. You're going to be faced with a question that says, hey, this is legal. And one of the choices is going to be, hey, let's not worry about it. But the extra behavior is going to be that's unethical. And so you're going to have to identify. So look at the bottom, meeting high standards of ethical behavior. Now, we want to go from the individual to the firms. The Institute is very big on things like, hey, you know what? Even if I am behaving legally and ethically, there's a possibility that I could encourage one of my colleagues to act unethically. So if a colleague comes to me and says something like, hey, we have an IPO and I'm thinking about distributing some to my family before I do everything else, do you think I'm going to get caught? And you might say, well, you know what? I would never do that. But you know what? It's a small IPO. If you give them 10 shares in your family, no one's ever going to know about it. And so the question will be, hey, who violated the professional standard on priority of transactions? The obvious one is, this colleague. That's an obvious. But I violated because I encouraged unethical behavior. So what that does then, if I'm encouraging unethical behavior, then that's going to do little by little, and all of a sudden the entire firm is going to have anarchy, and there's going to be no ethics inside. So that's why the Institute uses the term culture of ethics, culture of integrity, the desire to make morally appropriate decisions. This makes sense. What the Institute wants us to do is say something like, you know what, we think the firm should adopt these standards. Make sure that our supervisors, the Institute calls them senior management in here, that even if the firm does not adopt the CFA's code and professional standards, that they have their own set of rules and regulations to promote this culture of integrity. And this is what I tell my students, this is what I tell my families. A lot of times in my investments class, I'll give 3 parts to exam. I'll give part 1, they can take it at home and they can take it over this, let's say 6-hour window. They have, let's say, an hour to do it, and they have to self-regulate, and they have to sign a little thing that says, hey, you know what, I'm going to not cheat, I'm going to do all these things, I'm going to behave in an ethical manner. And I say to them, I'm saying, look, you can sign this and you can cheat. And I might find out about it because, I'm not dumb, but I might not find out about it. But I say this, look, if you're unethical in small things, then when you get to be an adult, you're going to be unethical in large things, and that's going to cause problems for you. I learned this from my mother when I was a little dude. My mother taught me so many things, and I miss her terribly, even as a 63-year-old. So the point is, these series of slides that we have here, they start from the individual. So this is a kind of a bottom up. Start from the individual and work our way up to the firm. Look at that bottom bolded. Practical, ethical decision framework. Muscle memory. I guess that's the muscle memory up here in the brain. Let's move on and ask ourselves the question, how do we know that these next 7 recordings that I'm going to make are appropriate? The Institute is saying something like, hey, full disclosure, what we're doing is we're going to convince you as the member or the candidate that our code and our 7 professional standards have been formulated with the following process. So notice in the bold up there, we have the word effectives. So we've got this Standards of Practice Council that's made up of volunteers. And what this SPC does is exactly what the Institute asks us to do. They review, they monitor, and they look at the dynamics of the industry. So let's take a look at these 6 things, and these are probably pretty standard. You shouldn't be surprised looking at any of these. Represent high standards of professional conduct. That makes sense. Relevant to the changing nature. Oh my gosh, this is a great application and an example of the Institute walking the walk and talking the talk, or whatever that saying is. Look, the Institute, they're going to ask us to monitor and review and be aware of the dynamics of changing environments, globally applicable, of course, comprehensive, practical, and specific, enforceable. That's a good one there, because if you say something like, you know what, you're not allowed to do this, and the Institute has no idea that you're doing that, and there's no way that they can determine that you've done that, and they can't enforce it because of some other reason out there. So it has to be enforceable. And then this is relevant for you guys. It's testable for the CFA program. All right, so here are these 6 components of the Code of Ethics. And you're not going to be surprised by any of these words here. Act with integrity, competence, diligence, respect, and in an ethical manner. But what does that mean? It means we're dealing with clients and prospective clients. I talked about that just a little bit ago. We're going to have professional standards that relate to the employers. We're going to have that relate to prospective clients and clients. We're going to talk about our colleagues. We're going to talk about other participants. But then notice that first word there, the public. This goes back to my example of showing up at a basketball game. Although, you know what? I'm going to go ahead and say this. I'm not accusing anybody. Those of you who are golfers will know that there's a big golf tournament in the spring, and on the 16th or 17th hole, it's a par 3, and the people in the stands, I'm guessing that they go and they might drink some beer before they go to these stands. And when someone hits a good shot, they throw bottles of water down on down on the green, and they pretty much act like teenagers at spring break. So I wonder if there are any CFA designation holders out there that are in that audience. Anyway, so my point is, don't forget to include the public in that first component. Second thing, this is super important. We'll talk about this in a video coming up shortly. You've got to put the interest of the clients above their own personal interests. This means putting them put clients ahead of your personal interests, but also your spouse's interests and your children's interests and your cousin's interests and your aunt and uncle's interests. What did I say just a little bit ago? You're going to see the word reasonable many, many times. Here we go in component 3, reasonable care, independent, professional judgment. So that independent word there, that means that you're not going to show any kind of a bias towards or against certain individuals or groups of individuals while you're making investment recommendations. Here we go. Practice and encourage others. This was my example of telling my colleague that he can go do some front running on that IPO. Integrity and viability of the global capital markets for the ultimate benefit of society. And then, of course, the final part of this, the final component is that, and I tell my students this all the time, and I'm a living example of this, that once you get your degree, once you guys pass level 1, it's not over. Once you pass level 2 and 3, it's not over. We need to continue to improve. The Institute is very interested in saying, okay, this is how good you are. This is how good we want you to be next year. And then this is how good we want you to be the year after that. All right, let me go through these 7 standards here pretty quickly because you're going to watch 7. At least I hope you watch 7 videos. What the Institute did on this recent go-round is add competence to the first standard on professionalism. And please don't think that the Institute before this edition was allowing its members and candidates to be incompetent, but it felt necessary to go ahead and add competence. And that's what we're doing here in levels 1, 2, and 3. We're going to learn about the Black-Scholes-Merton option pricing model. We're going to learn about collateralized debt obligations. We're going to learn about mortgage-backed securities. So we're going to increase our skill level. We're going to increase our competence. Note at the bottom, there we go, next 7 videos. Duties to clients. There we go. B, fair dealing. This is what I was talking about with the IPO. The C, this is a super important one. The Institute is very big that if you got 10 clients, one portfolio is probably not suitable for all 10 of those clients. You guys know this, that I never try to guarantee questions on the exam, but I do know the Institute really emphasized this idea of confidentiality. So make sure that you keep good records and that you are aware of all the confidentiality. Duties to employers. The big thing here is that the Institute doesn't want you to leave your employer and take all of your records with you and all of your clients with you. Now, you can do this if you ask for permission. You can say to your current employer, hey, I'm going over here. Can I take these 7,000 clients with me? And they'll probably say no. And you're also going to find that you're going to have some consulting jobs out there, so additional compensation arrangements. And what's going to happen there is that the Institute is going to say, look, they don't want you to not take that job over there as long as it's not in direct conflict with your current employer, but you just make sure you disclose it. Investment analysis, there's the diligence word that I was telling you earlier. Record retention, I just mentioned that. The conflicts of interest, the Institute has always said to disclose the conflicts. And now the point of emphasis is, you know what? If you can avoid it, then go ahead and avoid it. So you got to make up your mind, this is what I did earlier in the slide, right? Is it a massive conflict? You need to avoid it. If it's a minor conflict, then just disclose it and do your best to make sure that you adhere to the code and all of the standards. And then the last one, responsibilities of a member or a CFA candidate. And this is the use of the designation. And so if you get a question on the exam where you say, hey, here's Jim, and this is how he tells everybody about his credentials, and it says Jim, PhD, C.F.A, throw that one right out. All right, that takes us through this. I had fun making this one. We're going to have really extremely detailed videos over the next 30 minutes or so. So my recommendation is for you to set aside some time where over, let's say, a 3 or 4 day period, you can watch all 7 of those videos. I can pound this all into your brain. That's probably not a good word, pound. How about I can transmogrify into your brain? For those of you who ever read Calvin and Hobbes, there's your homework assignment. Go read Calvin and Hobbes. But what I want you to do now, there are 10 questions at the end of this learning module. I want you to go whiz through those 10. I guarantee you can make 8 or 9, at least 8 or 9, if not all 10, based on our conversations just now. But then what I'm going to ask you to do after each of the 7 learning modules, I'm going to ask you to go and work on the 49 or so questions that are at the very end of that learning module. Now, of course, after you watch the first video, you'll only have 1/7 of the material, and you'll get a bunch of them wrong. But as you go through each one, I want you to learn and learn. And after you watch the 7th and you go through the 7th, you'll probably get all 49 of them correct. So this is my way of encouraging you to study like I did. Back in the old days, I told you I got the handbook out and I kept reading these examples over and over again. So if you go through these 7 times, I think you'll be prepared. Now remember, we don't have any idea what you need to pass, but I think if you go over those and you know those 49, you'll be able to hit 70%. Nobody knows if 70% is the passing rate, but I'm guessing if you get 7 out of 10 questions right, that sounds an awful lot like a pass to me. But then again, I'm just a humble professor here trying to help you guys pass. So I'm done babbling there at the end of this recording. So hey, thanks for watching and have a great day. Good luck studying.